William Randolph Hearst, he was one of the wealthiest guys in the world, built a media empire that influenced the Spanish-American War, but he liked Billy Graham. And he liked Billy Graham because Billy Graham's message was, yes, it's pro-gospel, but it's also that thing that the communists hate. They hate God. They hate religion. They hate Christianity. We need more of that in America to inoculate ourselves against the communist influence.
And it's almost like God is pushing the world to a crisis moment. Why? To get us to show what we really believe in our heart. If you really believe something, your words and your actions are going to align with it. And so God is like pushing the world, saying, okay, I want you to be in a position where you got to show what you really believe. And so now the kids are like, oh, I want to be accepted, but now they're pushing their trans agenda or these other different things. You know, you think of Disney pushing millions of dollars worth of product. This multi-million-dollar business is based on what? Getting a child to want something.
Welcome to the Give Me Liberty podcast of the Standing for Freedom Center at Liberty University, where we defend life, liberty, and truth to ensure the foundations of freedom exist for the next generation. I'm joined by an author, historian, a good friend, Bill Federer. Welcome, sir. Great to see you again.
Ryan, great to be with you.
Yeah, we're in the People's Republic of California.
Lord have mercy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Have mercy. I will say this. There is a remnant. I feel like you go around and certain parts of California, there are bright rays of sunshine, in spite of, all the nonsense that we see on TV. Yeah.
I did a podcast last week with a guy named Apollo from Lithuania. And when they were mandating that everybody in the country get the shot, he and his wife went to Spain for 2 years, and then they came to America, and then they came to California. And he said, growing up, that I never had a religious discussion with anybody. He says, my friends would get together and we'd be talking about all kinds of stuff. He says, religion wasn't even on the table. He says, I came to California because I didn't realize how religious America is. I'm like, California?
Right.
And he starts talking about how he gets invited to church, and then there's the praise and worship. He'd never heard that before. And then people like living their faith and meeting some of these courageous pastors where they have the courage to speak the gospel, but also to stand up against unrighteousness, in the government. And so he said, I got baptized in the pool. Pastor Rob McCoy baptized me in the pool in my apartment complex. I'm like, oh, wow. But it was interesting that, here we think of a California, with communism, more or less, with the government here. But when you compare it to the rest of the world, there's a revival. There's a strong Christian remnant that's rising up. And to me, whenever the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord raises up a standard against him.
Yeah.
And whenever you have, 100,000 Midianites, you have a Gideon and the 300.
Amen.
Whenever you have the Philistines, you have a David, and the Egyptians, you have a Moses. And it's like God matches the evil with courageous people who are small in their own eyes, but big in faith and courage.
Yes.
And so I'm encouraged.
Yes.
With that. But America is approaching its 250th anniversary. And, one of the things that I back up, did a book on the history of socialism, and there's a communist tactic called deconstruction.
Yes.
Where you separate the people from their past, get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. It's a drive, neutral, reverse process. It's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently brushing with. You're still brushing with that stuff. Haven't you read the article? It'll eat the enamel off your teeth. You're like, oh, really? And you're repulsed by it. Now I have you in a neutral, you're open-minded. What are all the toothpaste out there? Then I can give you my pitch for this brand new target control breath freshener toothpaste. And so what they do is they go into the classrooms and they intentionally tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They were chauvinists. They sold people into slavery, and the kids are like, ew, they're all bad. And they separate from them and everything they stood for.
Yes.
Forgetting the fact that they gave you a present, and that present is you get to be in charge of your life, and all of us together are in charge of the country. Like, forget all that. They were bad, so I'm going to reject it. And then the kids are in a neutral. They're open-minded. Hey, let's have a comparative religion class. And then they give you their pitch for socialism, LGBTQ+++, adult child attract, anything, or radical Islam.
Yes.
And you look at Europe. Europe went through this. It went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods. But then it went to a secular Europe with the French Revolution.
Yes.
Right? Voltaire, free sex, anything goes. And now it's turning into an socialist Islamic Europe, with Muhammad being the number one name for newborns. And so this idea is they've tried to get us to forget our founding fathers. And when our founders were human, but they gave us a president, and that president is we get to be in charge of our lives. And then all of us together are in charge of the country, government from the consent of the governed.
Yeah. By the way, Yuri Bezmenov, I think, is the name of the guy that was the old KGB agent. That there's this video that is circulated on Instagram and social media for several years now, where he talks about he defected to the United States, right? And so he talks about the process of demoralization, deconstruction, essentially sowing seeds of doubt into a particular culture, using propaganda, and essentially getting to the culture, to the state where it is then ready for a revolution, for a color guard revolution, or for a change, or whatever. And for years, the Soviet Union did this under communist regimes. And then, of course, the People's Republic of China, the CCP, they have ways of infiltrating in countries and doing development projects and all that stuff. But fundamentally, they are trying to, just like their Cultural Revolution, where they're trying to get rid of the four olds, they consistently are trying to propagate certain narratives. And the first thing, like you say, getting it into neutral, is to get us to doubt our history, our founding, what do we know to be true, and then to then get us to villainize that very thing. And so Hollywood's been doing this for years. The entertainment industry's been doing it. You couple that with the Department of Education and the media, newspapers and the like, New York Times, the 1619 Project is what I was thinking from just a few years ago, coming from a New York Times reporter. That has been debunked, right? But by many, it has been debunked. But that has been quite potent for those folks that are in the youngest generation that have grown up maybe in broken homes. They've grown up in a broken situation, a desperate situation, maybe even grown up in poverty. There's not a lot of joy that they've experienced. And so you set that with, and by the way, yeah, these people were terrible people. Well, the people I know in my immediate life are terrible people. It doesn't surprise me that they're terrible too. Right. And so then it doesn't take a lot of imagining to understand then when a pallet of bricks shows up in Main Street, USA, they want to pick up those bricks and throw them through the windows of businesses, Molotov cocktails, all that stuff. They want to destroy it. Yuri, I think that's the name, Yuri Bezmenov, but he was the one who was basically saying 40 years ago, yeah, this is a part of a communist plot to take over countries.
Yeah, I quote Yuri Bezmenov in my book, Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present, and it was an interview in 1980 with Edward G. Griffin. But it's interesting, after World War II, countries in Europe were trying to dig out of the post-war situation, and they would form republics and elect leaders, and it all looked good until the Soviet Union decided to send in KGB agents to do critical theory. And critical theory is, Yuri even mentioned, he goes, you think of spies like James Bond? He goes, no, it's actually quite simple. We just study groups. So they just study all the groups in the country, economic groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, Bosnians, Croats, Serbs, religious groups, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, and they categorize them as victims or oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they organize protests that they escalate into riots and violence. Why violence? Because if you get your friend killed, you're so emotional, you don't want to sit and talk philosophy. You're like, they just killed my... And then once you have the bloodshed and violence, people want to blame somebody for it. So they co-opt the media and they blame the new leader of the new country for all the problems.
Yeah.
And as people begin to believe the media and the leader's popularity falls, then they can do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And then the violence stops because they were the ones that were doing the violence. And,
Yeah.
and so they go through this brief period of thinking, oh, well, everything's good, until they realize they just gave up their free government from the bottom up, and now they're replaced with a dictator top down.
Yeah.
And then I was actually looking before that, and it goes all the way back to Lucifer is in heaven, and he's sowing discord. Right? He gets a third of the angels. I will be like the Most High. I will put my throne above the throne. I will, and he gets cast out. So what did he do? He goes into the garden and he sows discord.
Right.
Dad to blame Eve and Cain to kill Abel. And then there's an interesting story of you have the Book of Judges, and there was this leader that wanted to Shechem. And the name escapes me for a moment here, but he's an illegitimate son of Gideon,
Right.
and Abimelech is his name, Abimelech. So Gideon dies, and he has his sons that are in charge, but Abimelech is from an illegitimate son, and he goes to the town of Shechem, where his mom was from, and he sows division. He says, is it better for you that the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your flesh and your bone. And the men of Shechem said, well, we got to support him because he is our brother. So they identify with him on a fleshly level, and then he sows division, and he ends up killing the sons of Gideon and taking over, making himself king.
Yeah.
And Israel's republic would have ended here rather than a century later with King Saul, had not somebody threw a millstone over the wall and killed Abimelech. But it's this idea that here's united Israel, but here's somebody wanting to sow division and split it from the inside.
Right.
And so you have Machiavelli 500 years ago in Italy, which was a bunch of city-states, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena, and they always fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So the end was good. So his philosophy is the ends justifies the means. So if a prince wants to conquer different city-states, and his goal is to unify Italy and stop all this infighting, then he can do any means to get there. Lie, cheat, steal, murder, whatever. And so the prince would pay criminals to kill cows and burn barns and throw bricks through windows and smash things, and everybody would cry out for help. And the prince would come in and get rid of the very criminals he bribed to create the mess. Nobody would know the better for it, and everyone would praise the prince as a hero.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, but like you think about 1920, this was the National Socialist Party, right? Creating all this havoc in Germany, in Berlin, until finally you had the total unification of Germany under the consolidated power of Adolf Hitler. And so it's just, it's insane, but that's how these things happen. What's interesting, Bill, is in 2020, the mostly peaceful protests, the BLM, all of that stuff, hundreds of millions of dollars pouring in from Wall Street, corporate America, the same money that was funding the LGBT, sort of the trans movement. You had all of these cities that were on fire: Chicago, New York, Portland, Oregon. You had the autonomous zone, I guess, up in Seattle. All these strange things that were, and then all of a sudden it's like, it's over, right? And you think, if this was an organic thing, if this was really a people's movement, if this was really just people that were sick and tired of being sick and tired or whatever, how do you get them to disperse? How do you get them to stop doing that? How do you get them to not show up? That's crazy. You would think it would be uncontrollable, right? But somehow it was controllable. In fact, it just ceased to exist. It just kind of went away as soon as the election was over. Oh man, gone, right? And then I won't go into the whole J6 thing, but what was crazy about that moment, by contrast, is that what was happening there around the Capitol, very, very different than what was happening all around the country. St. Paul, I think it was St. Paul, Minnesota, they burned an entire police precinct burned it, just burned it to the ground. Complete lawlessness. People were dying. Many Black Americans were dying in the name of Black Lives Matter, which is insane, at the hands of lawless criminals who were not going to be prosecuted. And so it's almost impossible for any sane, rational person not to see the very same thing that Uri was warning about.
Once you begin to recognize it, you can see it in different eras of history. And it's like all of a sudden it stands out. So it's like you buy a car and all of a sudden you notice everybody else that's driving the same car.
Yeah, reticular activation.
There you go.
It's your eyes are drawn to the slug bug, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and so when you go back to Greece, you had a democracy, and you had Philip of Macedon. He's the father of Alexander the Great, and he's conquering different cities, and Thebes and Amphipolis, and then he gets the gold mines there, and then he takes money and he bribes some citizens of Athens to betray their own city. So there's no king in Athens. They have the Agora marketplace, and everybody shows up, and they all sort of talk. And the people were saying, well, we need to get our military prepared because Philip of Macedon is headed our way. And the paid liars, propagandists, would stand up and say, wait, I hear Philip's not such a bad guy. He's not conquering these cities. He's liberating them. And the people actually like him. And these paid liars would gather around themselves what Lenin later called useful idiots, people that believe the lies. And they would get their, BLM, Antifa following of people holding their side. And it so confused and split and divided Athens that when Philip marched up to the walls, they couldn't mount a unified defense, and they open the doors and he takes over. And the British did this, and they became the biggest empire in the world. And when you study how they took over India, India was a bunch of kingdoms, and they never got along. In 1714, a British ship lands in Bengal. The king is sick, or his son is sick, but this English guy knows a little medicine, doctors him up, and he survives. And the king's like, okay, here's some gold and anything else. I'd really like to open a trading post. He's like, well, okay. Well, the trading post turns into a trading fort, which turns into the British having guns. And then they would give guns to one kingdom and then guns to another kingdom. And then they would stir up ancient animosities between the kingdoms, right? Rub raw, and then it would break out into fighting and bloodshed, and they would weaken each other. And then the British would come in to restore order, and they would conquer both of the weakened kingdoms. And they did this again and again and again until they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. They did it in the countries in Africa and around the world. And they tried doing it in America during the Revolution, where the British General Johnny Burgoyne meets with the Mohawk Indians. And the Indians and the Americans had reached an equilibrium. They were sort of getting along after the French and Indian War. And the British stirred them up and promised them money for scalps. And so then the Mohawks would attack the Americans and scalp them. It was so bad, it was listed as one of the 27 reasons in the Declaration of why we wanted to rebel against the king. The king has excited domestic insurrection among us and has incited the merciless savages of the frontiers to butcher the inhabitants of our settlements. And the Indians would, kill irregardless of, race, sex, or condition. And so the pattern is, if you want to conquer, it's hard, but if you can get the opposition to fight itself, there's different stories in the Bible, even Jehoshaphat or maybe Hezekiah, where there's this coalition force coming against Israel.
Yeah.
And then they pray, and lo and behold, they start fighting each other. And then Israel can collect all the spoils. But this idea was coalesced and put into a nice, neat equation by a guy named Hegel. And so you had Napoleon conquers Europe.
Yes.
Afterwards, the king of Prussia said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen our Prussian state. So Germany wasn't Germany. It was a bunch of kingdoms, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony.
That's right.
And so...
It was united by Bismarck later, basically.
Right.
Yes.
Otto von Bismarck. So Hegel is at the University of Berlin, and we know him because he had a student named Karl Marx.
Yes.
But Hegel took...
And the Hegelian dialectic is the very thing that he bases his principle of economics, or the the power structures on
Exactly.
Hegelian dialectic. Yeah.
And for those that are not familiar with it, it's taking the status quo. It's a triangle. One corner is a thesis. The opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis. Your top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. You start off with a status quo. Everybody's used to the way things have been going on. You have to create a problem that's really bad and get everybody to panic and fear so much that they're willing to surrender some of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad.
Right.
That becomes the new thesis starting point.
Yes.
Then they create another problem that's real bad. Everybody panics and fear, gives up some more of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. That becomes the new starting point. Then you make that the thesis. You create another problem that's real bad, and you settle for it. And as you move across the page, people are gradually giving up their freedom to the state, and the state is getting strengthened and stronger. And the you look at even FDR said, remember the Nazi technique. Pit race against race, religion against religion, divide and conquer. And so then you look at Castro, and he says the revolution needs its antithesis. The revolutionary needs the counter-revolutionary. And if there is no enemy, they have to be fabricated. So you can't get people at the status quo to say, hey, we want you to give up half of your freedoms. Like, why? You need to create an enemy that gets the people so scared they're willing to give up half.
It's like Orwell's 1984. Like there's always that other Oceania versus same type of thing. So a common enemy, even if it's fake.
Yeah. So when you come to today, you say, okay, well, we need an enemy. Well, we need somebody that we can have the media paint as the bad guy, and then the government's going to rescue us from this bad guy. We had a major reprieve from that when Elon Musk bought Twitter.
Yes.
It broke their
echo chamber.
Their echo chamber.
Yeah.
And but there's some interesting thoughts along this line. If
yes, let's talk about it.
So when they co-opt the media to blame the leader of the country, they're using media. So when 1800s. Marketing was Wells Fargo wagon and Sears catalog, and they would list everything about a Singer sewing machine.
By the way, that's like your internet and your Amazon, right? I mean, like in that time, right? So you had Wells Fargo. That's the one that's going to take things and move it around, right? And then your Sears and Roebuck was your Amazon before Amazon.
Yeah, that big,
Craftsman Homes came from them.
Yeah,
they came in kits, and you could build the house
for $5,000.
For $5,000, those houses are now worth like $2.5 million in certain cities. It's crazy. But anyway, yes.
So you would buy something because you knew all the details about it. But in the early 1900s, you had the beginning of magazine ads. And you would buy something because the ads made it look like everybody was using it and they liked it, or maybe had a famous Hollywood actor or actress that's pushing it. And the classic was Crisco. Nobody knew what was in Crisco, but they marketed it so well, it put out of business the lard industry, right? They make soap and stuff out of lard. And what's in Crisco? It's cottonseed oil. In the Deep South, they would harvest cotton and have these mountains of black seeds that they didn't know what to do with, and they would mush it into this black, mucky oil that they would use in machines and factories. Nobody ate it, but it's called industrial seed oil. And then somebody had the idea of bleaching it, put it in these nice containers with this ad campaign, and we've all eaten it. So you go from knowing everything about a Singer sewing machine to nothing about some product, and you're ingesting it.
Yeah.
Because you see this impression that the person that came up with this idea was Edward Bernays. And he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst that discovered that we are social creatures.
Sure.
We want to be accepted. We don't want to be rejected.
Yeah.
And as simple as that is, the whole premise is built on that. So it makes it look like if you buy this product, this perfume, these tennis shoes, you're going to be accepted, right? And if you don't, you're wearing the old stuff, you're going to look. And so Edward Bernays said, women go into a department store and think they're picking out shoes. They're not. The shoes were picked out for them by the marketing executive.
Yes.
That paid the actors to put them on, that paid the photographer to take the pictures, that paid the magazines to print it. They see it in the magazine. He goes, in this way, women are controlled in this area of their private lives. And he goes, in the same way, in a democracy, whoever controls the public opinion molding is the true ruling power of the country. So we're a government from the consent of the governed. But what if you could engineer the consent of the governed? So Edward Bernays wrote a book called The Engineering of Consent.
Absolutely. By the way, I just want to point out, so like, you know, a lot of people scrolling on Instagram, social media, Facebook, doesn't matter. There's listening tools that are built into that, right? And so it's interesting, like some people have a conversation about camping, and then all of a sudden there's advertisements that are going to come to them in the form of like, well, this is a special tent, you know, this is a Coleman stove, this is, you know, you name it, these are hiking boots. Like all of a sudden those things start to show up in the feed, right? And so they're very clever about this, but there are all kinds of ways in which they can spy on, you know, users and how they interface. And so built in, you know, that's everything from cookies to you name it, they can know a lot about the consumer behavior and habits of those people, but also curating it in such a way that they're enticed to consume more of this or that. And so it's fascinating. But that, going back to Elon, had Elon not bought X, you know, had not broken through that echo chamber, had not, and there's a thing called a reflexive loop, that idea that you can create a thought, that thought or an idea publicly, circulate it around. It can be a total lie, but it's in a closed reflexive loop to where you can almost manifest that thing. So in the way of like critical race theory, we have these race wars, and we have victims and we have oppressors, and there are oppressors everywhere, and they're violent and they're terrible. And then the moment that something happens, aha, see, we told you. And so the idea of these movements is to create as many George Floyds as possible, a Floyd-type movement, because that's the moment where a revolution, potentially cultural revolution, can take place, and then you topple over government, or you pressure governments into making certain concessions, right, that they wouldn't otherwise do, or you put pressure and threats on a grand jury or a judge or whatever to get a certain verdict. But they've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, you know, I was reading something years ago about Billy Graham, and they did surveys of people that came to his crusades, and they said the average person had 5 impressions before they made the decision to go to the crusade. They heard it on the radio. They saw it on a billboard. They saw it in a newspaper. They saw it on a bumper sticker. You know, they saw it, right? And it was enough. And so the idea is that we're social creatures.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah.
So this is where God. So let me say one thing. I love that you pointed this out. So like William Randolph Hearst, who's probably not a Christian. I don't know him personally. Like, I don't know how he died. I don't know what his convictions were when he died. But he was like the Rupert Murdoch of that time. You know, here in the state of California, they have the Hearst Mansion. It's owned now by the state because nobody could be custodian of it. It's too expensive to run and maintain. But he was one of the wealthiest guys in the world. Built a media empire that influenced the Spanish-American War. There were, you know, just by insinuating that the cause of this could have been Spain, and then there we are. We're in war before we know it. But he liked Billy Graham, and he liked Billy Graham because Billy Graham's message was, yes, it's pro-gospel, but it's also that thing that the communists hate. They hate God. They hate religion. They hate Christianity. We need more of that in America to inoculate ourselves against the communist influence and the rise of the Red Scare. And so he wired this to all his newspaper outlets, Puff Graham, and Billy Graham became a household name. And that was a moment in which I would say righteousness was riding on the back of just a tycoon in the media who said, you know, I might like him for these reasons, but America's going to love him, and we need to promote him as much as possible. And there you go. Millions of people hear the gospel from Billy Graham because of William Randolph Hearst. Yeah. Whether you like that guy or not like that guy, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always, Frederick of Saxony basically underwrote Martin Luther translating the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? And Martin Luther dedicates his first issue of it, to Frederick of Saxony. But but I was thinking about, okay, we're group creatures. We want to be accepted. We don't want to be rejected. At the founding of America, 98% of the country was Protestant, 3 million people, 1% Catholic, 30,000 Catholics and 3 million. All Catholics were originally only allowed in 3 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. And 0.1% Jewish, 7 synagogues in the entire nation. Mm-hmm. So the country was almost completely Judeo-Christian. And so you would have non-Christians, but for them to be accepted in the group, they would adopt Christian behavior. Now, we would have hoped that they would all get saved, but nevertheless, they would adopt this Christian behavior because they wanted to be accepted in this, what they perceived as the group. Well, now they have co-opted the public opinion molding. And so now the kids are like, oh, I want to be accepted, but now they're pushing their trans agenda or these other different things. And, you think of Disney pushing millions of dollars worth of product. Frozen T-shirts, frozen pajamas, frozen Band-Aids, frozen, lunch.
You got to let that stuff go, but yes, it's a joke. the lyrics of the song, sorry.
But it's all based on what?
Yeah.
Getting a child to want something.
Right.
This multi-million-dollar business is based on what? Getting a child to want something.
Right.
And so they've realized that these kids are social creatures and they want to be accepted by their group. And if they make it look like, oh, if you have this T-shirt, you're cool. And if you don't have it, you're left out. And so they've taken that and moved it into the classroom. And they call it social emotional learning,
yes.
Behavior modification.
Yep.
And they have the pyramid of oppression. And at the top of the pyramid are the cisgendered. Cisgendered is their term for somebody who believes there is a male and a female. Mm-hmm. They're at the top of the pyramid. They're the oppressors. Everybody down the pyramid, the asexual, bisexual, transsexual, pansexual, anything sexual is being oppressed by the oppressors. And then they ask the kids, which one are you? Well, none of them are going to pick the bad guy oppressor, so they'll pick anything else. They've had hundreds % increase in trans, non-binary identifying kids in the last 5 years. It works. Kids want to fit in. They get celebrated if they come out, and they get shamed. Oh, you're
That's right.
Intolerant. And, a water molecule is individual, but you put it with other water molecules and they operate in a group.
Since 1971, Liberty University has had one mission: training champions for Christ. We've been at this for a while, and in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, we have grown to be a global force. Today, Liberty runs over 100,000 students around the globe, studying across 15 colleges and schools.
And, among them, over 30,000 military students.
Across 700 programs of study, we train as one: nurses, artists, business leaders of the future and today. Together, we work to give back through service trips, local community work, and over 500,000 volunteer hours per year. And we play just as hard as we study, with 20 NCAA athletic programs and 40 club sports teams. So, who are we? We are Liberty University, and we train champions for Christ.
So, on that note, and this bears this out statistically, you poll that generation, I think it's Gen Alpha, in terms of social cohesion and in the group. And this is one of my arguments for why Christian parents absolutely need to be in the driver's seat when it comes to the child's education, because when they relinquish that control to a local school, all of a sudden their social groups, their identity groups, their value formation, all of that worldview is not centered around the home. They've left the home. They're outside the home. Mom and dad are at work. It's not that they can't come back together for dinner discussions and all that. That's wonderful. I hope they do that. But during the day, they've formed a value relationship, and there's also tiers, in terms of your, whatever you call it, social equity, let's say. Let's just say that this person is more popular, that person's less popular. I want to be more popular, so I'm going to do all of these things that are necessary. wearing the right clothes, saying the right things, believing and expressing the same beliefs as my peers. So that happens, right? That's really the danger of that situation. Putting them in that context. Anyway, I had another direction I was going to go with that, but shoot, what was it we were talking about just before then?
Water molecule in a group.
Water molecule, and then before that, oh goodness, y'all, I lost my train of thought.
Yuri Bezmenov.
No. Goodness,
Marketing, Disney.
Okay. So, shoot, man, I totally lost my train of thought.
Well,
I had another way I was going to go kill that, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, you'll come to you, and you can just interrupt me. But I was thinking, a fish in a bowl, but you put it with other fish, and they operate in a group. A bird in a cage, but you put it with other birds, and they operate in a group. We're individuals, but you put us with other individuals, and we're always giving and receiving feedback.
Yeah.
Are we being accepted, or are we being rejected? And they've manipulated it so that if you want to be accepted, you adopt this certain behavior pattern or views, and if you are rejected, and all the kids want to be invited to the party and pick for the team.
Yes.
They want to be not invited, right? And so they've weaponized this loneliness, and it is when you expose it, it loses its power over you. Sort of like, I'm the great Oz, and then the little dog Toto pulls back the curtain. You see an old man, you're not afraid of him anymore. If you are in it, you're like, but then when you realize somebody's manipulating your desire to want to fit in. And I was thinking of Peter was with a group around a fire, and a girl gets in his face and says, "You were with Jesus." And you can just picture Peter looking around the group, and everybody's eyeing him, and he realizes he's about to get kicked out of this group, and he says, "I never met the guy."
You're right.
It's like, that's it, Peter. You caved that quick. It is a real fear to be kicked out of a group. But then after the resurrection, Peter's called into the Sanhedrin and said, "We told you never to speak in his name or we'd kick you out of the group, the synagogue."
Yes.
And Peter says, better to obey God rather than men.
Amen. And I always go back to this public school example. They polled more recently Gen Alpha, and the issue of the LGBT movement, the trans, all of that. 1 in 4 are identifying as a part of LGBT or even queer, right? And on that spectrum. However, when you look at the number of young people or anybody who is receiving or undergoing gender transition surgeries, taking puberty blockers, right, chemical castration, the number drops down to less than a 0.001%. It's very, very small. It is only measured in the thousands, the number of actual surgeries that are happening a year. And the point of all of that is, it is not a sacrifice for somebody to say, "Oh yeah, sure, yeah, I'm a part of that. I believe in that movement, or I identify with this group." Because all it is about acceptance. So if I say I am, if I check that box, then I'm accepted. If I say I'm not, going back to the example of Peter, oh my gosh, I face all of these repercussions. So I'd rather just say, yeah, I'm a part of this. I'm with you. I support you. But as you say, the moment that veil is removed, people immediately say, "No, I'm jumping ship. I'm going to abandon it." So if for example, if it was no, in order to identify fully with this movement, you have to undergo a transition surgery, immediately it would drop off because people would have real repercussions. Now, sadly, tragically, Chloe Cole, there are many others, have undergone that, right? And they have suffered irreparable harm to their bodies. Soul's intact, mind is intact. They've come back from it. They've repented. They've come to a realization, and my goodness, I can't believe that these adults would have allowed this to happen and would have counseled me this way. But their bodies are irreparably harmed. Anyway, when there's a cost, when there's a true cost to it, that's the moment that people wake up.
Yeah. And I sometimes think God is letting the evil be exposed to push us to a decision-making position. So in other words, we're not robots. We're free will beings. And God's like, okay, we're getting close to the end of this. We're the bride of Christ. And so every romance novel builds up to a decision-making moment, forsaking of all others and choosing the one. God's like, okay, I need you to make your decision. I'm going to make it really clear. God, devil, choose. I mean, I'm 67. I've never seen before, Satan statues in the Iowa State Capitol and Target.
By the way, that's illegal. I just want to point out, you're exactly right. And I think it was Michael Cassidy that tore it down. And there are still laws and statutes in the state of Iowa. Now, Supreme Court has overturned blasphemy laws, but that was an unlawful display according to state law in statute in the state of Iowa. It never should. So these are pansy lawmakers that just sort of allowed it to happen. And then somebody took matters in their own hands and said, I'm going to tear it down. This was the Gideon moment of like, you know what? Let Baal contend for himself, right? So he goes in there and just knocks it over. Anyway, I agree.
Yeah, and it's like God is pulling back the curtain and saying, God, devil, choose. He won't force us, but he's like, I'm going to put you in a position, like a romance novel, a girl is got a couple guys that are courting her. And, one guy, maybe she's leaning toward, but it's her big night. She's got her dress and she's all excited. And the guy calls and says, oh, I got a business meeting. I'm going to miss tonight. You'll understand, won't you? And then this other guy's willing to crawl across glass just to spend a few minutes with her. She's like, you know what? This crisis moment shows who really loves me and who doesn't. And it's almost like God is pushing the world to a crisis moment. Why? To get us to show what we really believe in our heart. I mean, salvation is what you believe in your heart and you confess with your mouth, right? And then there's a prescribed action, getting baptized, right there. And so if you really believe something, your words and your actions are going to align with it. And so God is like pushing the world, saying, okay, I want you to be in a position where you got to show what you really believe. And it's some people are going to, and it's a moving goalpost. So if you want acceptance by the group, it's going to continue to move further and further and further to the left. I mean, here's J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter, and she was sort of on the left, but then she had a friend that believes there is a male and a female. And what happens? She gets canceled. She's not going to go with the moving goalpost further down. And so they just, okay, you're not part of our group anymore. You're bad, right? And so when we're pushed to this point of saying, okay, I'm sorry, I tolerated something I didn't feel good about. And then I stretched the rubber band and tolerated something else I didn't feel good about. But I'm sorry, I can't be silent when they want to castrate a little boy because he played with his sister's Barbie dolls.
Right.
And I can't be quiet when they want to do a hysterectomy on an 8-year-old girl because she went through a tomboy phase. And they cut the rubber band and it snaps.
Yeah.
And I think I was pushing the world to this moment to have us make a decision. And it's fascinating that the group consensus. So there was 1960s and 70s, the Solomon Asch conformity experiment, where they wanted to test how people, how far they will go to fit in with the group. So they had 8 students in a room, 7 had been paid ahead of time to be actors, and 1 was a naive participant. And the teacher put 2 cards on the front desk. One card had 1 line and the other card had 3 lines, one shorter, longer, and the same. And beginning with the paid actors, one by one, they would say that the shorter line was equal to the first line. By the time it got around to the 8th naive participant, 30% of them would deny their own eyes to fit in with the group. They're looking at the lines, they're not equal, but they're like, well, maybe these people know something. They'll doubt themselves, doubt their perception, right? Because they want to fit in so much. And then Chuck Colson talked about a wine tasting, and everybody was in on it except one naive couple, and they poured vinegar in the wine. And this couple writes, this tastes terrible. But one by one, the other couples would say, oh, this was robust. It had character. It was great. And then when it got to this couple, they said, well, yeah, it was really good. They caved, and they wanted to be in with the group. And then when someone said, I think they just poured vinegar in, the couple that changed their views criticized the person for saying they poured vinegar in. And it's a phenomenon called false enforcement. Once people yield to the pressure of what their perception of the group believes, then they end up becoming an enforcement to make other people fit in. It's like they don't know why they're wearing something on their face, but they're going to pull out their camera and make sure that you're wearing it, right? It's like these little electrons line up and they carry that charge to the next level.
Yes.
And then there's the Korean War prisoners. So World War II, prisoners were rescued and they loved America. You know, Hogan's Heroes, the Great Escape movie. You know.
Oh, yeah.
But in Korean prisoners, they isolated them for days, weeks, months, until they got to this emotionally vulnerable spot of just missing being around other humans. And when they were at this weakened emotional place, they would bring them into a room with guys who had already caved. And before they could be accepted in the group and get their emotional reinforcement, they had to reject America. Okay, yeah, America's terrible, America's bad. All right, you're one of us, right? And they got rescued, and they still hated America. It went into their emotions, their psyche. And they studied it in America. What happened to these guys? And they find out if you take a population and isolate them for days and weeks and months in their house and social distance them until they get to this emotionally vulnerable spot. They say, I just want to go out shopping. I just want to be with another human. I want to go out to dinner and say, yeah, but before you can go back to having these relationships, you got to put this in your body and wear this on your face and let us track you everywhere you go. And it's like, yeah, whatever. I just want to get back to normal. And so they weaponize this human desire to want to be a part of a group. And it's interesting because it's counterfeit Christianity. It's counterfeit God's plan, and it is counterfeit church, right? The idea that God wanted the church to be the emotional reinforcement, and
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because I'm thinking of there's numerous examples of the youngest generation is one of the loneliest, most depressed generations that we've seen to date, right? And so a lot of them are on social media. They're separated from their parents. They're raised in single-parent households. They spend the majority of their time away, almost like latchkey kids. So mom or dad are at work, and so they've got their digital devices. I saw this story even more recently of somebody that said they would prefer 80% of people, and this isn't a scientific poll, but 2,000 Gen Alpha generation folks polled, young people, that they would consider marrying AI. And there was somebody more recently who proposed to this AI tool and emotionally sobbed because they got a response in the affirmative that the AI tool agreed to marry this person. It's nonsensical. It's farcical. We all laugh at that. That's ridiculous. But there is something to be said for the psychological breakdown of a human being that is no longer thinking rationally. Their emotions have been stirred. They've been taken to the point of utter loneliness, depression, duress, that they're not thinking or seeing clearly, and that inability to process, because we are emotional creatures. The noetic effects of sin in Scripture, in Genesis chapter 3, are such that we are not purely rational. Our brains are not CPUs. We have thoughts, ideas that we can't fully explain rationally. We know in Scripture the heart is deceitful above all things. It is desperately wicked. Who can understand it? We oftentimes can't separate our mind and our heart. I mean, it's the same catalyst vehicle by which we process. We process thoughts emotionally. We always want to take it back to the Scripture, so we have a firm foundation and we can test it. We have some standard. But when you think about, just like you said in the Korean experiment, you think about people who are depressed constantly, who are they're not getting enough sleep, they're not getting enough exercise, they don't have enough social or community engagement, with other people, like a church, they're going to be given over to all kinds of wild and crazy ideas, not just Marxism, but transhumanism. You don't need a human partner. You can just use this this device, and this device would be interchangeable with another human being. It's insane.
You know, I was reading an article about University of Zurich did a study with AI and Reddit, Reddit. It's
Yeah.
a website where people post questions and answers.
This, by the way, Reddit is a perfect example of where the pump and dump scheme, with GameStop, and people would go on there and say, hey, you ought to invest in GameStop. And they went up, in price and value a couple of years ago, and it came crashing down. Yes.
And so the AI went through, for this period of time, the Reddit users and built a profile of each user. And then they had bots, right? BOTS, it's like a computer that posts answers. And so the bots would post answers to these different people, their questions, and they found out that the bots could get the users to change their views 6 times more effectively than a human could get them to change their views. Right? So here they can study a profile of somebody, and these bots can generate answers that can sway that particular person to change their views. So in other words, they collect all the data so everything that accesses the internet, phone, iPad, computer has a ID, and they keep track of all the information. I mean, they know how long, when you're scrolling through TikTok videos or something, if you hesitate on one and look at it a couple extra seconds,
Yes.
it knows that, it runs an algorithm, it finds out what that content is, and it will grab it off the internet and bring more of that same content and just keep feeding it to you.
Yeah.
I mean, and so you could almost have a customized delusion for you. You know, at the end times, it says, God had strong delusion. It's like, yeah, there can be a customized one just for you. And it knows all your pleasures, all your fears, and it can try to motivate you in your decisions. And then you look at that politically. So I was looking at the Cold War and these tactics. You mentioned yellow press, William Randolph Hearst. Spain was trying to put down a rebellion in Cuba. And they had a General Valeriano Weyler, Veyler, and this guy was brutal. He said, okay, all you Cubans who are law-abiding, I want you to live in concentration camps. And everybody that does not voluntarily go into a concentration camp is going to be assumed to be a rebel and will be shot on sight. So they get hundreds of thousands of people in these concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of them die. There's no proper sewage. There's no proper food. They're open to the weather. And the cry of this comes to America. But America is like, we don't want to get involved. We just got done with a civil war. And so they didn't have the ability to print photographs. And so Hearst sends Frederick Remington, an artist, to Cuba in 1897. And he says, you provide the pictures and I'll provide the war. And so they would, you see a picture of this skeleton starving person. Well, they would draw the little etching of the skeleton, and they would print these. And it did. It moved the public to pressure the politicians to say, we need to do something and get involved. And they printed on inexpensive paper that turned yellow after a couple days, and so they called it yellow press journalism. But the press realized we've got the ability to sway the public, which can sway the politics. And so after the World War II, the Soviet threat was serious, and Americans were back to normal. And so the head of the CIA was Allen Dulles, and he had Operation Mockingbird. And there were Carl Bernstein, the Watergate reporter, in 1977 did an article with the Rolling Stone magazine called The CIA and the Press. And he said the CIA has 400 people embedded in mainstream media that will take the CIA's talking points and feed them into articles to the public to wake the public up as to the Soviet threat. Well, it became public, and they had the Smoot, whatever the name of the bill was, but it was a act to get the CIA to dismantle that program, as if anybody believed that they would dismantle it. But then you have President Obama in 2015 brings it back with an executive order using behavioral sciences for the benefit of the American public. That's the name of the executive. What's behavioral? It's PSYOPs.
Yeah.
And he authorized himself to feed these. And then in 2016, he signed the Using Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which gave him the authority to decide what's disinformation, what's not. And based on him pushing his politics, right, had Lois Lerner auditing conservative groups, but not the liberal ones.
Right.
And so here he's able to silence voices. But now with AI, this ability to silence voices and magnify other ones, and then your perception of everybody's going along with this, and then you want to move. So this is something that, as we get closer to the end times, and it talks about, the delusion.
Yes.
And it's like,
First Thessalonians.
that they can actually take your image and your voice and have you saying something that wouldn't be you.
We've done that for fun. We had a conference last year, and we had famous voices of the conservative movement. We even had President Trump's voice, introducing some of our speakers and our guests. Sounded just like him, when he'd come over, and it's incredible what they're able to do with this kind of technology.
And, I was thinking, end times, it says that Satan can appear as an angel of light, so why be surprised that his ministers can appear as ministers of righteousness? I thought, how are you going to know if this is something from God or something is not? And it's the content. So it's like, okay, it could look like Ryan, sound like Ryan, but he's saying something that Ryan would never say.
Right.
And it's like, wait a second, I know Ryan. He would not. And so it's like, look, I've read the scripture. I know Jesus, and Jesus would not say that.
That's right.
But the people that don't know Jesus are like, well, it looks real. It sounds real. It's like, it's only knowing the word of God that will be able to protect you from being deceived.
Vodi Bakum just recently, so he's now president of a new seminary down in Florida, but he just came back from Zambia. He had been out there for several years. There was a group online that was taking content from his videos. They were using AI generative tools to essentially create a deep fake kind of thing where he was saying certain things completely contradictory to what he believed. And they had to legally pursue this in order to get them to take it down. Wow. But this actually happened with Vodi Bakum, with his actual voice. Gospel preacher, theologian, conservative leader, but they were trying to use the messaging tools in order to say something that's completely detrimental to his ministry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's happening.
Yeah.
And so I think the Take It Down Act is one of those things that they passed more recently. It has more to do with pornography, but as a whole, in principle, AI should not be able to use the name and likeness as a false representation of any individual in any situation.
Yeah.
But again, knowing the person, and you can say, wait a second, I wrote a book on the history of Islam.
Yeah.
Muhammad was illiterate. He could never read the Bible. His father dies before he's born. His mother dies when he's 6. His grandfather and guardian dies when he's 8. He's taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who takes him on camel rides, and he goes to different countries and hears about different religions, a little Persian, Zoroastrian stuff, a little pagan, a little Jewish oral traditions, and even Encyclopedia Britannica said the gospel was made known to him through apocryphal and heretical sources. And so in the Hadith, he's in a cave and a spirit appears to him, and he doesn't know how to test the spirit. He even goes to his wife Khadijah, and he thinks he's demon-possessed, and she decides to test the spirit by removing some of her veils, and then removes some more veils, and says, "Can you still see the spirit?" And he goes, "Yeah, over there, And then finally, she put his head under her shift, whatever that is, and said, "Can you see the spirit?" And he said, "No." And she said, "Well, it must have been from God because it was embarrassed to look upon me without all my veils on." It's like, that was the test.
Wow.
To decide whether the spirit.
And then he goes to an uncle, her cousin who was an Ebionite Christian priest of some heretical sect, and he says, well, maybe that was the spirit that appeared to Moses, and then he dies, and so Muhammad's left with the spirit. But Muhammad didn't know the scripture.
Right.
Right? And he could never read it. The word Quran means recitation. It's an oral thing. But if you don't know the scripture, you can be deceived.
Absolutely.
And so, but anyway, I wanted to, we started off talking about the 250th anniversary of America and how unique it is. And I thought about throughout history, kings would dictate what people believed. And there's actually 6 stages that at first you had the king over the government and over the church or the belief system. So you got Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king of Babylon, but he says, okay, I'm going to also be over your beliefs.
I'm thinking of Code of Hammurabi too, and those types of, right? I mean, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, Nebuchadnezzar, you bow to my statue or you're going to the fiery furnace.
That's right.
I don't care if you have any warm feeling in your heart for my statue. I'm going to, right? And then you have the kings of England, Henry VIII, right? He had William Tyndale burnt at the stake and Sir Thomas More, killed. And so kings wanted to be over the government, but also wanted to be over the church. And there was actually about 1,000-year period where the pulling of the church out from underneath of the king. Mm-hmm. Starts with Jesus saying, render to Caesar what's Caesar and to God's what's God's. And so it's like, okay, so Caesar's not over both of them, right? So we have the Pope pulling the church away from the authority of the king. And so, often we don't give the credit there, but it was significant. And the kings would always want to appoint the bishops.
Right.
And be over the church that way. And the popes would always threaten to excommunicate the kings. Mm-hmm. But they pulled it away. And so now you had the king ruling the government top down and the pope ruling the church top down.
Right.
And then you had the Reformation with Martin Luther. And you had the invention of the printing press.
Mm-hmm. Gutenberg,
and everybody could have their own copy of the Bible. And the pastor, instead of him being the intermediary between the person and God, and be a spectator religion called clergy laity, where the clergy does the ministry and the laity is lazy and watches. Instead, with this congregational emphasis, the pastor helps everybody to have a direct relationship with God the Father through Jesus Christ that died on the cross to pay for their sin. And then the pastor coaches each individual to become a mature Christian. Read through the Bible yourself. I'm going to help you, and I'm going to help you.
Priesthood of the believer.
Yeah, and then the pastor trains the saints to do the work of the ministry. Mm-hmm. And you come up with a bottom-up, congregation-involved church, right? Where you have the elders and the deacons, but everybody's involved, and it's a bottom-up church versus a top-down church. And then you have the Pilgrims coming across to America, and they were going to go to Jamestown, Virginia, and submit to the king's government. And they get blown off course to Massachusetts. And there's 102 of them on the boat. And the captain says, everybody get off the boat. And they go, who's going to be in charge? Nobody's been picked by the king. They take their congregational church government and they make it their civil government.
Mayflower Compact.
Mm-hmm. And now you have a government bottom up, which eventually turns into the Constitution in our form of government. Then you have but this is an important period of time.
Yes.
Where you literally had churches founding cities. So the First Baptist Church in America founded the city of Providence, Rhode Island. Everybody's involved in church. Everybody's involved in city government because it's the church founding the city. Mm-hmm. Got the first congregational church founding the city of Hartford, Connecticut. Right? Everybody's involved in church. Everybody's involved in city government because it's the church founding the city. The word for city in Greek is polis, and the business of the city is called the politics. Mm-hmm. And they agree on policy, and they're supposed to treat each other politely. And if they don't do that, there's police.
Right.
But you have they had one building in town called the Meeting House. That's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. That's where the rabbi would teach the law. That's where they do their city business. And they got their idea from ancient Israel, that first 400 years out of Egypt before they got a king.
Right.
Called the Hebrew Republic. But then you have, after a century, it gets a little dry, and they teach it academically at Yale and Harvard. God has a plan for everything. A plan for your life, marriage, family, church. You got to find what the plan is, put it into place. And they got less evangelistic. And David Brainerd got expelled from Yale because he said his professor was as spiritual as a chair. The Yale students actually got reprimanded because they were caught going into town and preaching the gospel to strangers on the street. And they had not been licensed to preach yet, and they weren't wearing a black robe. It wasn't in the formal setting of the church, and it was considered disrespectful.
And this is prior to the First Great Awakening.
Yeah. And so the Puritans got nicknamed Old Lights. Then you have the First Great Awakening, which are called New Lights. And they said it's more than a plan. You have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change, and you won't do worldly things anymore like bars and brothels and government. It's like, wait, what was that last thing? Yeah, government, it's worldly. If you're really Christian, you're not going to be involved.
Yeah.
This is different than the entire 1600s, where everybody's involved in church and everybody's involved in city government because it's the church founding the city. They're like, yeah, we're not going to do it anymore. If you're really spiritual, you're going to withdraw from worldly things, including government.
Isn't that Lutheran pietism a little bit?
Exactly. Yeah. So Martin Luther had a personal experience with Jesus, and he was willing to stand up to the most powerful government leader, King Charles V of Spain, and tell him to his face, unless you can prove me wrong from Scripture, here I stand, so help me God. It was personal to Martin Luther, but some German princes have been waiting for a chance to break from Rome, and they go, this is it. Kingdom of mine, I just made the decision, you're all now Lutherans. And they're like, okay, we're Lutheran. What do we believe? So for the people in those kingdoms, it was not necessarily the same personal experience Martin Luther had. It's just a new state doctrine. So this revival movement starts called pietism. It said being a Christian is more than doctrine. Even if it's good doctrine, you have to have an experience with Jesus. When you do, your life will change, and you won't do worldly things like bars and brothels and government.
Yeah.
And it actually helped these Moravian Lutheran pietist missionaries go around the world, because they could go into India or, Iceland or wherever they were and say, look, we're not here to change your government. We just want to get people saved. And they're like, okay, you're not a threat. Come on in. They didn't realize that when they came to America, that America's a republic. And this non-involvement message is you're producing a negligent king.
Yeah.
Word citizen means co-king. And now saying don't get involved. And so 4 centuries of this teaching in Germany of the church not being involved because they're holy allowed Hitler to seize power and put Jews 100%. On train cars. And when trains would go by the church, they would sing louder.
Yeah.
And it's like, I see there's something wrong with this picture. So this pietist movement in this First Great Awakening revival, it was great that it brought people to a personal experience with Jesus, but you had this byproduct of people saying, I'm going to withdraw from worldly things, including government. Well, if all the spiritual people withdraw from government, who's left to be involved but the less spiritual?
Right.
And because they're less spiritual, they're going to yield to their ambitions, become power hungry, and turn into tyrants.
Yes.
And they're not going to be content with ruling the government bottom up. They're going to want to rule top down. And they're not going to be content with ruling the government top down. They're going to also want to rule the church top down. Tell you when you can have church, when you cannot have church, who can be your pastor, what the pastor can say, what he can't say, right? And we're back where we started, with a Nebuchadnezzar government being over the government and over the church.
So you're looking for a university that's perfect for you, a school that has anything you could possibly need.
Anything?
You want a place that has the programs you want to study, and maybe a few more, just in case you change your mind.
I think I'm going to sign up for the fashion design program.
All right. A place with state-of-the-art facilities. I mean, look at this campus.
And who doesn't love big time sports?
And great recreational activities.
Okay, now we're on a roll. Somewhere you can hike, slide, strike, shoot, climb, eat, and most importantly, eat. You want a place that takes you to space? Okay, maybe not, but we can teach you how to fly, or pastor a church, or run a business. And all that with a great view? Yeah, I think I know a place.
Yeah, man. Okay, so this is fascinating. So, I went to seminary, theological student, and you look at the two kingdom model, which was in Lutheranism, but it was also in Calvinism. And the difference between Calvin and Luther is exactly that point on the point of pietism, because whereas there was a strict separation between the church and the state within Lutheranism, Calvin, which was influential on Presbyterians and even Reformed Baptists,
And Dutch Reform, yeah.
Reform was wholly different than that. Both were responsible and servants of the Lord, right? And then the church had a responsibility to hold the state accountable. And so the church was in many ways its conscience of the nation. And when you look at the state, Christians are involved in the state. What's interesting in this American identity crisis is that today, many people have taken more of the Lutheran position or the Anabaptist position, that we just jettison and we get out. And before the raptures happen, we've already raptured ourselves. We pulled ourselves out of secular society, out of human society, out of government, because that's filthy, that's dirty, that's yuck. And we're gonna sit over here on the mountaintop or the mountainside, and we're just gonna wait for Jesus to come back. He can be here any minute now. And so that's been going on for a long time, decades and decades and decades. It's more of a Harold Camping kind of theology of the imminence without any presence of church activity or church witness or discipleship. It's just we're sitting at a bus stop and just waiting for the Lord.
And I was thinking, asking the question, who do you think you're going to meet when you're raptured? Jesus? Does Jesus love the little children? Oh, yes, Jesus loves the little children. You think he might wonder why you didn't do anything to protect them? Right? They're aborting kids. If they're transgender, they're mutilating little kids, right? I mean, Jesus loves the little kids. And then I wrote a book called Silence Equals Consent, the Sin of Omission. So the same way you're silent at a wedding ceremony, you're giving your consent. Well, if you're silent when they're killing kids, you're giving your consent. Leviticus 20, it says, any Israelite who sacrifices a child to Molech shall be put to death. If any member of the community closes their eyes when that man sacrifices a child to Molech, I myself, the Lord, will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from Israel. All you got to do is close your eyes while they kill the kid and you're cut off. I was thinking of people saying, well, I'm really spiritual. I don't get involved in politics. So I'm going to let ungodly people teach kids in public schools that God does not exist. Would God want the kids to be taught he didn't exist? And if the kids think he exists, they come to the conclusion he's messed up, putting men in women's bodies. You have to have operations and lifetime of pharmaceuticals to fix it. What a messed up God. And if that behavior is not sin, what behavior? Well, sex outside of marriage. The little library books that show the kids, try this kind of sex, try that. If sex outside of marriage is not a sin, arguably there are no sins. And if there's no sins, you certainly don't need a savior to save you from your sins. They're undermining the entire gospel. So you have to admit it's a pretty clever trick the devil's pulled.
Yeah.
To get Christians who believe the gospel of Christ are willing to let their children be taught the gospel of Antichrist. Right? Oh, I believe Jesus. I mean, if it is a personal experience, isn't it important enough to want your kids to have a personal experience with Jesus? Because if you're not involved, what they're teaching the kids is going to undermine
That's right.
any potential belief in the Lord.
That's right.
And I would look through the Bible, and then Acts 22, Apostle Paul's talking to the Lord, and he says, and when they shed the blood of thy martyr Stephen, I stood there silent, consenting to his death. Paul didn't say a word when they stoned Stephen. He just stood there. And Proverbs 24 says, rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to death. Don't stand back and let them die. Don't try to disclaim responsibility by saying you didn't know about it. For God, who knows all hearts, knows yours, and he knows you knew, and he's going to hold you accountable.
Yeah.
The Mordecai told Esther, there's a mandate from the government to kill the Jews. If you're silent, you and your family will be killed, and God will raise up somebody else to deliver Israel. I was thinking of the story in Numbers, chapter 20, if I remember correctly. Moses and Aaron are called to the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord spake to Moses, take the rod, gather the assembly, thou and Aaron, speak to the rock, water will come out. Well, they gather the assembly, and Moses takes the rod, and he hits the rock twice, and water comes out abundantly. End of the chapter, it says, Aaron will not enter the land because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. It's like both. We just read the chapter. Aaron did not do a thing. He didn't say a word the entire chapter. It's like, yeah, that's just it. He was at the door of the tabernacle. He heard God tell Moses, speak to the rock. When Moses lifted up the rod the first time and hit the rock, it probably took Aaron by surprise. When Moses lifted up the rod the second time, Aaron knew what was coming, and he did not protest. He was silent. And in that instant, Aaron was guilty. Moses's was a sin of commission. Aaron's was a sin of omission.
Yeah.
Leviticus 5 says a person sins because he did not speak up, even though he was an eyewitness to a case or knew what happened. Anyone who failed to testify is guilty. So it's the sin of not speaking up. You know the verse everyone has memorized, Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself?
Yes.
The verse immediately before it says, confront your neighbor directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. But what?
Right.
One translation says, rebuke your neighbor openly so you'll not incur their guilt upon you.
Right.
So they're loving each other, and they're confronting each other. It's like a parent. You love your kid, you love your kid, but every now and then you got to correct your kid.
And by the way, this was a discussion I was having earlier today, that the unspoken 11th commandment in the evangelical world today is thou shalt be nice. And niceness is killing truth. It's killing genuine Christian love. Genuine Christian love isn't silent. It speaks up. It speaks the truth, and it speaks it in a timely manner. And so it's fascinating because a lot of times these verses are stripped out of context, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. By the way, the social justice, you go to the Matthew passage where Jesus separates the Olivet Discourse. He separates the sheep from the goats, and then he says in these last times, he basically says, he talks about you offering water or you feeding someone. As much as you've done to the least of these, my brothers, you've done also to me. Christ is very clearly saying that this is actually a church community. These are my brothers. This is not just anyone. And those passages have often been hijacked, taken out of context. But in that passage in Leviticus, to love someone is not to just allow them to fall into judgment. You have to rescue them, snatch your brother from the fire, right? Yeah. If they're standing in the middle of the street and a bus is coming, push them out of the way. Don't let them get hit by the bus that is God's judgment. Yeah.
You know, the different verses in the Old Testament rebuke the oppressor. Proverbs 28 says, he that is silent when somebody does something wicked will be cursed, but he who rebukes the wicked, a good blessing shall come upon him. And then the New Testament, it says, if your brother sin, rebuke him. And then it says, be instant in season, reprove, rebuke. And then you can do it nicely, because I think it says in Timothy, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. Well, what does entreat mean? It doesn't mean being silent. It means you're speaking up politely, but you're speaking up.
You're right.
And so there's this movement, that's I think is part of that pietism that says, okay, the bad things are happening, and did you just sit back and don't do anything? It's like, no. My son and I just put together a book. It's called Courageous Christianity. And it is on the muscular Christianity movement that gave birth to the YMCA. But it's this idea that you can be strong as a Christian and speak up and defend the innocent. And so it started out of the Second Great Awakening with Charles Finney, and he's the one that said, do something. He says, being a Christian is more than listening to sermons, right? You have to have a heart change, and then you're going to want to do something. And so out of this, you have, William Catherine Booth read Charles Finney's sermons and starts the Salvation Army.
Right.
But there's a guy in England named George Williams, and he's 23 years old, and he's a draper selling drapes and upholstery. And the young salesman would go to taverns and then go to, brothels. And he's now a Christian because he heard Charles Finney preaching. He says, I don't want to do that. So he came up with the idea of a place where guys can have Bible studies and exercise together. And it turned into the YMCA, 1844. And within 10 years, it is in 9 different countries. And they have the head of the YMCA in Geneva, Switzerland, Henry Dunant, is somebody that, I want to do something. And so he's walking across a battlefield after the French and Germans fought, and there's all these groaning bodies. He said, we need to have a group that takes care of all the wounded, no matter whose side they're on. And he starts the International Red Cross. And of course, Clara Barton helped him, and so she starts the American Red Cross. But that came out of the YMCA, which came out of the Second Great Awakening revival that says you have to do something.
Yes.
And then you look at Jeremy Lamphere was going to Charles Finney's church in New York, and there's an economic downturn in 1857, and he puts a sign in front of his New York business, come in and pray at noon. And maybe a couple guys come in, but the next week a couple more. Next week they have 100. Next week 1,000. Then they start opening up all over in Chicago and Boston. And it's nobody's planning it. They're just springing up, and it's this revival movement that came out. And they would meet in the YMCA's because everybody sort of felt comfortable going there. And then in Chicago, a young shoe salesman named D.L. Moody. And he gets saved during this Great Awakening. He volunteers at the YMCA, taking out the trash and cleaning things. And then they make him a city missionary. They're not paying him. He's just, right? And he sees an abandoned saloon, and he decides to get inner city kids for a Bible study. And somebody visited there, and he says, yeah, D.L. Moody could barely read. He had this little black boy in his arms, and there was a lamp, and he's struggling reading the prodigal son story. He couldn't even pronounce the words. And he says, if God could use that guy, he can use anybody. Well, he wasn't all that literate, but he was good at recruiting people. And within a year, he had 60 volunteers teaching 600 kids.
Yeah.
Within 2 years, there's 1,500 kids. And even Lincoln, he gets elected president, goes from Springfield, Illinois to Chicago, Illinois. On his way to D.C., he goes in Chicago to D.L. Moody's Sunday school class. And afterwards, D.L. Moody says, well, Mr. President, anything you want to tell these kids? He goes, yeah. He goes, I started off as poor as any one of you in here. And if you all do what that man tells you, someday you might be president. Wow. But this, it all came out of this Second Great Awakening revival, they actually call the movement muscular Christianity movement, that you could be a strong Christian. Why? Because you want to defend the innocent. And the Apostle Paul uses all these athletic analogies.
Yeah.
I don't box not as one boxing the air and run the race and fight the good fight.
Beat my body in submission, right?
Yeah,
right.
And
discipline myself.
And so you're a spirit-minded body. In the Middle Ages, there was this sort of Gnosticism that said everything fleshly is bad and everything spiritual is good. And so if you're really, really spiritual, you'll deny your flesh till you're 80 pounds, right? And it's like, wait a second, God made you a spirit and a mind and a body. Jesus rose from the dead with a resurrected body. God designed it. It's a good thing. It just needs to be used for his glory. And so this idea, if we can be a strong Christian men, and women, but I'm a man, and we focus in the book on men and the Young Men's Christian Association. And so you have the World War I, and Elwood Brown is running the YMCA in Manila, Philippines, and he is over in Europe. And while they're not fighting, he organizes sports competitions. And somebody named de Coubertin in French, he sees this, and it fits in with this idea of, hey, let's bring back the Olympics and have guys from different countries come. And so for the first couple decades of the Olympics, there was YMCA athletes that were competing. So the YMCA came out of, the Olympics came out of this muscular Christianity movement. There was even a school in England in a town called Rugby, and you know where this is going.
Oh, yeah.
And so there was a school of rugby, and the head of the school was Thomas Arnold, and the boys would fight. Boys will fight all the time, and he says, hey, let's come up with fighting with rules, and we'll make a game called rugby. So it's fighting with rules, and they would have the scrum, whereas you got a pile of guys, and they're one of them holds the ball and they go down the field. And so that developed into football, where the scrum turned into the line of scrimmage.
Yes.
Right. But that came out of this muscular Christianity movement. And then you had Luther Gulick, a doctor that taught at the YMCA, came up with a spirit, mind, and body logo. In the middle of it was an open Bible with John 17. By this all men will know you're my followers, your love for one another. And then behind it was the PX, or the two letters, first two letters of the name for Christ, right?
Yes.
The X and the P. And so he It was in the 1890s. It was wintertime in Springfield, Massachusetts, YMCA headquarters. And he's like, we need to do something a little more exciting than jumping jacks. And so he gets one of his trainers named James Naismith to hey, come up with a game. And he tacks 2 peach baskets on the wall, and they would throw a soccer ball in it, and then get a little ladder, get up and take the soccer ball out. But then the bottom fell out of the basket, and then they would start tackling each other. And so he came up with these 13 rules of basketball. And the next year they printed it in the YMCA newsletter, and it went worldwide, and it became the ideal evangelism tool, right?
So what I find is fascinating is that it's almost as if like there is nothing. I mean, everything from hospitals to orphanages to schools, but then all these other institutions, right? Like things that you don't think about, which is the YMCA or basketball or rugby. These are invented by Christians as well, and it's not by happenstance. There was a purpose for which they did it. It all had a missional component. Fulfilling the Great Commission, James chapter 2, right? Faith without works is dead. Today, most Christians, not just secularists, but most Christians are severed from that historic understanding of that framing. They're not. There's no connection to history. Most of the world that we live in today, the things that we see founded and started by Christians. I'm on the street where just outside of this hotel, there's a Chick-fil-A. It's a Christian-owned business. There's an In-N-Out burger, Christian-owned business. Like you go around and you look and you're thinking, wow. I mean, what is it that Christians haven't done, right, in terms of shaping and ordering society and influencing things, and not just in politics, but in business and entertainment, culture. It's all interconnected, but so many people have no clue. The things that we do on a daily basis, the things that we're a part of, we turn on and we watch the NBA Finals, turn on the TV. But the game of basketball, you know where that came from? And to your point, I think a lot of people, they don't have an understanding of the value of history.
Yeah, it's interesting. Missionaries in China. But if you play basketball and the little Chinese boys see it, you say, hey, you want to play? Come here. I'll teach you how to play. And then you play, and then you start to become friends and everything. And then you're all winded. You sit down and somebody opens up a Bible.
Yeah.
And in Cuba, and I mean, it became the second most popular sport in the world, but it started at a YMCA, which came out of this muscular Christianity movement that came out of the Second Great Awakening revival. And then another YMCA instructor, William Morgan, developed volleyball.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then you have Billy Sunday, a Chicago White Stockings baseball player in the 1890s. I mean, this is before they had gloves. They would actually catch with their bare hands. And so he is in Chicago. He comes out of a bar, hears some singing of some songs that his mom used to sing, and they're gospel songs. It's the Pacific Guard Mission, and he goes there. And, of course, he sees this girl that he likes, and then he ends up volunteering at the YMCA. And the dad wouldn't let him date because he said athletes are ne'er-do-wells when their bodies give out, But then he goes ahead but then he's involved in the YMCA, and he becomes an evangelist, and they just invented radio. And so now he is the #1 radio evangelist in the world. But again, this muscular Christian, an athlete that gets saved. And then you have the Teddy Roosevelt. He's sort of the epitome of the muscular Christianity. He was a kid, his dad was really wealthy, but he was at a camp one time and he gets beat up. And his dad says, you need to start going to the gym. And he gets into lifting weights, and then in judo, and then he becomes a fighter, boxer. But then he's like, no, you need to be a strong Christian to stand up and defend the weak.
Yes.
And even Dale Carnegie started by teaching classes at the YMCA. The win friends, influence people, but they dream big. And he was a Christian. In some of his later books, he talks about, I'm a Protestant, and I, in New York, and I like to go to church and just sit there and meditate on God, But I think we forget that a lot of the things we take for granted were Christians that had the backbone and the strength to do good.
Yes.
And one of the quotes that we have in the book is from the Thomas Arnold, the rugby school, and he says muscular Christians have that old chivalrous Christian view that your body was given you by God to be trained and brought into subjection so that you can defend the weak. Because there are always going to be bad people.
Yes.
And those bad people will always want to take advantage of little innocent kids and abuse women.
Right.
And so you need good people with strength to stand up to the bad ones, because they'll always be the bad ones.
Yeah.
And weakness invites aggression. There's even a podcast with Jordan Peterson, and I think he's with John Stossel, but he's talking about, well, men need to be dangerous. He's like, what? Yes, but it's under control, because you have to realize that if you project the fact that you have the potential to harm a bad guy, he's going to back away.
Yes, he is. Yep.
And it's like, if you show fear and run from a dog, it'll be happy to chase you.
Yes.
But if you turn and show strength and yell at it and threaten, it'll stop and run away.
I'm reminded of something Erwin Lutzer wrote in a book not too long ago, but he obviously pastored Moody Church for many years, and he said, look, evil never retreats on its own. It must be confronted. And we're living in a time now where muscular Christianity, at least, is making a comeback, at least interest in it. Young men in particular, who have been imbued with this idea that there is no future for you in secularism. Secularism actually hates you because it's embraced the tenets of feminism and Marxism, and it hates men, especially men of valor, men of courage, strong men. Those things, those traits and attributes are actually toxic, and so the only way to be valued in society is either to be a victim or to be a weak man who capitulates to the left and remains silent, sits in the back, so on and so forth. Young men in particular are rejecting that one by one. Now, some are embracing a very perverse understanding of manhood, a kind of Andrew Tate vision of things, that men must be dominant, men must be disrespectful of women, and treat women like chattel property or slavery. Obviously, that is not a biblical view whatsoever. But then there is biblical manhood, and I think young men are wanting to see a more authentic, traditional understanding of manhood, one that values women, of course, protects them, but has a purpose for living, a purpose for existence. We've been made to fight, and we've been made to be defenders and protectors and providers. And so I think young men in particular are saying, like, we need to come home to something that is a semblance of tradition and looks like it's something that is ancient and old and has been around for a long time. So it's interesting to see that last year, at the end of last year, young men were buying Bibles for the first time. Bible sales were up, and they're starting somewhere. They want to see and invest and see what the scriptures have to say about life and about salvation and about who God is. Bill, your knowledge of history is virtually unparalleled. I know there are many historians, but I'm always amazed when we have these conversations how much you can go, your breadth and depth, being able to also take this thing and this thing that are seemingly unrelated, and then yet you're able to find the connective tissue. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know that. So I've learned a ton from this conversation. I've learned a lot about, I think about Dwight L. Moody. I didn't know that he was actually at YMCA. That's fascinating. I didn't know that Billy Sunday was connected to YMCA. That also fascinates me. But I certainly appreciate you coming on the Give Me Liberty podcast and schooling me. I'm grateful. It's a gift, but on so much information that is so helpful and needed at this time.
Well, it's always an honor to be on with you, Ryan, and you are doing a tremendous work. And we love Liberty University. I was just there recently for a conference, NACL, National Association of Christian Lawmakers.
Yeah.
Jason Raybird. And I had the chance of meeting Jerry Falwell several times.
Yeah.
He bought my books, and I had dinner with him a few times when I was running for Congress, and I was running in Missouri, and he asked me all the questions. Then he pulls out his phone. He starts calling pastors in Missouri. You need to have this Bill Federer come and speak. And it's like, Jerry Falwell calling and asking me. And just a tremendous ministry that's impacting the world. And so it's just a thrill to get to know you and see the tremendous work you're doing. And I'm always honored to be on. I've written about 30 books, so I'm happy to talk about any of them.
Yeah.
But we're excited about the Courageous Christianity book. I feel like it's hitting a nerve of, like you mentioned, that it's time for, I'll end with this last story. Judah has a wicked king, Manasseh, sacrificing kids to Moloch. And the prophets come to him and said, it's over. God is finally fed up. You're doing the same thing that the people that were here before Israel came in were doing, and I brought Israel in to judge them. And now since you're killing kids the same way they were, I'm going to judge you and drive you out. So the prophets prophesied judgment. But then Manasseh's grandson is Josiah. 8 years old, become king. Teenager, he starts to seek the Lord. Early 20s, he tells him to clean out the temple that his granddad had trashed and neglected, and they find the law of God. They read it to this young king. He rips his garments and repents, sends messengers to a prophetess in town named Huldah, the wife of the king's tailor, contemporary of Jeremiah. And she says, tell the man that sent you the judgment is coming, but not during his lifetime, because he repented when he heard the words of the Lord. And so for the rest of the lifetime of an entire generation, this 31-year reign of Josiah, there's peace and prosperity. He tears down sodomite temples. He sends the Levites out to teach the law. He has this enormous Passover. It says it was the biggest one ever. And so here you have this young man that says, he even tore down pagan temples that Solomon built hundreds of years earlier. And it's like, I don't care who built it, tear it down. I mean, he's got strength, and he's righteous and standing up. And God says, okay, I'm gonna let this generation enjoy all these blessings. So I'm praying for a Josiah generation. I believe there are those within the sound of our voice, somebody that's listening today, that God is saying, you're this new Josiah. God is touching you and saying, you have the backbone, and stand up, and he is going to give us a period of blessing for a generation. I'm believing that the Lord gives us time to see good things happen.
Yeah, amen. Good, and that's a good note to end on. The Lord's not finished, and there is a young generation, and I'm hopeful for that generation. So we're praying for that end. God bless you, Bill Federer. Thank you so much for joining the Give Me Liberty podcast.
Thank you, Ryan.
Hey, did you find this helpful? I hope you did. Please like and subscribe, share with a friend, and also go to standingforfreedom.com, where you can find more content, articles, podcasts, and our Theology of Politics series, all at standingforfreedom.com.